Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Jake, the Muslim metaphysician. Today, I got a special topic for you guys. As you guys may be able to see, the title of this stream is called Debunked. The Trinity is Necessary. And I'm going to explain what that means. If you look in the description of the title of the video, the description of this YouTube video, it says, I explain and debunk a popular Christian argument that claims that the Trinity is necessary based on God being all-loving. The argument also seeks to establish that a Unitarian conception of God is impossible, or at the very least, improbable. So that's what I'm going to be dealing with today, guys. It may be, you guys may have just heard it on a very basic level from Christians, maybe lay Christians that you've spoken to. I'm not sure. Depends on your experience. But it also is used in the philosophical literature from some Christian scholars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first explain to you guys what the argument is for those who aren't familiar with it. And then after I explain what the argument is, I'm going to break it down and explain why the argument falls on some fundamental levels. And a lot of people have been asking me to do this stream for a long time. So I hope that you guys will find this as informative and useful. I realize that there's a couple other big streams going on at the moment, other streams that people typically watch, like Hamza's Den. So shout out to Hamza's Den. I'm on there quite frequently. So I'm not trying to compete with my brother, but so I understand that not as many people will catch this live, and that's fine. But I hope that you guys will check it out later at the very least and be able to benefit from it, inshallah. So let me just take a look in the chat, see what's going on here. Let's see here, guys. All right, we got Shedman saying salam. We've got Potato Damage. Got a few people in the chat. Raccoon. I almost don't like calling you Raccoon. Salam, though. So, with that being said, guys, let's take a look at the argument. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the argument from a source here. Just give me 1 second to pull it up. Let me see if I'm able to pull this up real quick. Okay. Just bear with me, guys. I was kind of, again, stressed with the time because something came up at work. But let me see if I can find this for you guys real quick. Where is it? All right, so I got it here. Okay, so here's one form of the argument. Yeah, everybody's there at Hamza's Den. Everybody's like, dude, we got the den going down. What, Jake, nobody's going to join you. Man, I actually forgot about it. Hamza originally had asked me to come on and join the stream, but I typically work Fridays, so I'm not usually able to make it once every 6 weeks or so. So every 3 arenas, I'm able to make it. But that's cool, man. You guys can share it on your social medias, inshallah, and my regular subscribers will pick it up later. Otherwise, why are they subscribed? I mean, come on. You guys got to be faithful to Muslim metaphysician here. But no, it's cool. So one of the reasons why I'm doing this video is because it's really a popular argument that's used not so much in the philosophical literature. It is, but a lot by popular Christian apologists and those that follow their material. So one second here, I'm just typing a message. I'm going to read for you guys what the argument is, and then see if we can See if we can engage with this a little bit. Let's see here. Okay. All right, guys. So here's the argument. Premise one, necessarily God is perfectly loving. Okay. I'm just going to read the argument and I'm going to show you where the disagreement is. Premise two, necessarily being perfectly loving entails actually loving another. Premise three, necessarily any other God loves is either within God or is part of God's creation. Premise four, necessarily God was free not to create. Premise five, this object of love isn't part of God's creation. Premise six, therefore necessarily God must have another with him to love. And then premise seven, therefore necessarily it is not the case that God is unipersonal, i.e. that God is a single self. So those are the 7 premises, and what it's meant to establish is that a single self, or what we would call a Unitarian conception of God, is either impossible or improbable. So I know that was a lot to take in, but I'm going to break down the premises one by one. And I'll tell you where, because in order to deny the conclusion, we're going to have to deny one or more of the premises. So let's see which ones we're going to deny here. Now, necessarily, God is perfectly loving. As Muslims, we can agree with this. Allah is al-Wadud. So we agree that Allah is necessarily all-loving. This is one of his majestic names and attributes. So we agree there. Premise one, we've got no problem. Premise two, necessarily being perfectly loving entails actually loving another. Now, what do we think of this? Fundamentally, we think that it's wrong. So we think that this is, so I would deny, as well as many other Muslims and even Christians, which I'm going to show, would actually deny, and Trinitarian Christians, would actually deny that premise 2 is true. So I would say premise 2 is false. Necessarily, and I repeat, being perfectly loving entails, meaning it necessarily entails actually loving another. So I'm going to say that, first of all, no, that's false. What is the argument for premise 2 from a Trinitarian paradigm that the idea of God or something being all-loving necessarily entails the exemplification of that attribute in loving another, and that it must be done eternally? What's the argument for it? Typically, there really is no argument for it from Trinitarians. It's more of an assertion or an assumption. And so this is a fundamental metaphysical assumption about the nature of God and one of his perfect attributes. And it's a premise that we deny. So you have to give an argument that the attribute of God being all loving necessitates him loving another. And I don't think that the Trinitarian is able to bear that burden of proof and actually demonstrate that. So part of the reason why I would deny that, and so we've got, let me just give a quick shout out to Brother Ibrahim Iqbal. Just became a new member on YouTube, so consider clicking that join button if you'd like to support me and my work on the channel, inshallah. So appreciate that. And you can do the same on Patron as well. Now, back to this premise 2 here. So part of the reason, and I'm drawing from a Christian source here, actually, but I don't want to give it out because part of this is actually unreleased material. So I'm not going to specifically mention people by names here. But I had a very similar idea as this article expresses, and some of the arguments in it actually solidified my point. So I'm going to explain what some of these points are. So what the idea is, basically, being loving is a character trait. So it's an attribute of a subject, right? And the fundamental assumption is that a character trait or attribute cannot be had unless it's expressed. And the question is, why is that the case? Why should we buy into this? So first of all, the Trinitarian needs to provide an argument or justification for actually demonstrating that a character trait or attribute must actually be expressed in order to be possessed. So I'm going to make a distinction between possessing an attribute and expressing an attribute. Now, I think the Trinitarians are making an assumption that possession necessitates expression. Okay, so possessing of an attribute necessitates that the attribute must be expressed. First of all, I can deny that, and I can put the burden of proof on them to actually attempt to demonstrate that. Now, not only that, it's not just asking, so the first step is to ask, okay, what's the argument for it other than merely an assumption? Now, second thing is, I can give good reasons to actually doubt this assumption. So we can think of an example of, and this is mainly appealing to people's intuitions. So we can think of and this is just a thought experiment, of a person existing alone by themselves on an island. Let's say that there's other humans that exist, but this person happening, and I'm going to make it extravagant. This person happened to sort of was left on an island alone, and they were able to survive. Maybe they were taken care of by animals, whatever the case is, right? But no other humans no other humans existed on the island, let's just say. Now, would it be fair to say, for example, that this human being, and I'll use myself as an example. Let's say I'm the one who's on the island all alone by myself, right? So I'm on the island all alone by myself and there's no other humans there. Would it be fair to say that Jake couldn't possibly be friendly or loving just because I didn't have the opportunity to express my attribute of being friendly or loving? Well, no. Why should we think that? Why couldn't I possess the attribute of being friendly or loving even if I didn't have another to love? Meaning I could possess the attribute without expressing it. And one way to think of this is conditionally that if other humans were actually introduced to the island, if I were to act friendly to them or express a friendly nature and loving nature to them, if they were to actually be introduced to the island and I was able to have the ability to express that attribute, and given that opportunity that I actually would, then it doesn't seem at all inconceivable to me to say that Jake could be friendly or loving because I possess the attribute, even if I don't yet have the ability to express the attribute with other persons or other humans. There's nothing to me self-contradictory about that at all. Not only is it definitely not contradictory, but it doesn't even seem at all implausible to me. It does not even seem implausible to me. And guys, I want you to, some people are mentioning suggestions. I want you guys to understand there's not going to be one level of refutation or explanation of how we disagree with this argument or how I personally would tackle this argument. I'm going to give several layers to it. If you guys don't know me by now, Typically, I give several responses. I don't give just one. So I give several. So if you don't like one, you can like the other. So first thing is the idea that being perfectly loving, which is a character trait, necessarily entails loving another. I'm saying first move is to put the burden of proof on the Christian Trinitarian to actually demonstrate that. Okay? Now, I don't think that they can actually bear that burden of proof, and many times they just assert it as simply the fact of the matter, which I don't think it is. So that's the first step. Second step is to bring a counterexample of, sort of a scenario in which you can have a lonely person who's on an island who, would it be fair to say that he's not friendly or loving just because he doesn't have someone to love? No, he could possess the attribute even though he doesn't have the ability yet to express it, conditional upon the fact that if he were introduced to others, he would exemplify and express that attribute of being loving and friendly. So that's the second point. And in line with that is the assumption that they're making is that a character trait or attribute necessitates the expression of that attribute. And I'm going to show with the third response that the Christian Trinitarians themselves don't actually believe that, or if they do, they aren't consistent with their own methodology. Okay? So they're actually not consistent with their own methodology. Now, what do I mean by this? If they think an attribute or character trait necessarily entails the expression of that attribute or character trait, let's take a look at that when it comes to other attributes and see if they're able to be consistent with that or not. And if they're not, then it shows that they're inconsistent and they're just kind of special pleading almost for a particular attribute in order to try to substantiate their Trinitarian position. And I think this is going to become very clear. I think this is one of the fundamental proofs or arguments. So, in response to them anyway. And we can think of it as a parity argument. So it's an argument to show that we can take an attribute that they believe in and show that it leads to a conclusion which they don't accept. So premise one, necessarily God is perfectly loving. Would the Christian agree with that? Well, yes, they would. Premise two is going to mirror exactly the same argument that they put, except we're just going to input the word forgiving instead of loving. Now, and we would agree with premise one as well. Premise two, necessarily being perfectly forgiving entails actually forgiving another. Premise three, necessarily any other God forgives either within God or as part of God's creation. Premise four, necessarily God was free not to create. Premise five, necessarily this one who is forgiven isn't part of God's creation. Premise six, therefore necessarily God must have another within him to forgive. And premise seven, therefore necessarily someone within God has done something requiring forgiveness. So this results, notice it's a parity argument that when we insert the word forgiving, which is a character trait, and which they're going to agree with premise one, but what they may want to attack is premise two. Necessarily being perfectly forgiving entails actually forgiving another. If they want to say that this is false, then what that entails or implies is that they don't believe that a character trait such as forgiveness necessarily, in order to possess it, that it necessarily entails the expression of it. So if they want to deny premise two, then I will have the same ability to deny premise two when they state that necessarily being perfectly loving entails actually loving another. So I'm pointing out their inconsistency with their own claims. Necessarily any other God. Oh, okay. So before we go to the other premises in the argument, if they want to deny premise 2, and the reasoning they want to deny premise 2 is they can say, well, God actually is necessarily perfectly loving, and he's eternally perfectly loving, even though he doesn't express that attribute. Then what they are agreeing to is they are agreeing to the fact that a character trait or attribute can be possessed by an individual without the expression of it. And once they make that claim in order to avoid the conclusion of a person within God requiring forgiveness, then they must allow the Muslim or the Unitarian to respond to premise 2 of their argument to say, no, being perfectly loving, a character trait, doesn't necessarily entail the expression of it. I think that at this point, they cannot possibly get out of the argument and avoid their hypocrisy. And I'm sorry to use such strong language, but it really is very inconsistent on their own part. Now, again, we can do the same thing for being merciful, and being forgiving and merciful is somewhat similar. So they're related. Well, necessarily, I can say God is perfectly merciful. Premise 1, that is premise 1. Premise 2, necessarily being perfectly merciful entails actually being merciful to another. Now, again, take the attributes of being forgiving and merciful. Well, let's think of the Trinity. Does one of the members of the Trinity eternally express their forgiveness or mercy to one of the other persons in the Trinity? No, of course not. Because if they do, the idea of forgiveness or mercy actually entails that the other persons would require mercy or forgiveness, which entails that they must have done something wrong. And if they must have done something wrong, then they're not holy and they can't be God. So you see how it falls apart, that the Trinitarian couldn't actually believe or claim that, the Father was eternally forgiving or merciful to the Son or the Holy Spirit. Because if he were, then that would entail that the Son or the Spirit actually required mercy or forgiveness from the Father, which they wouldn't accept. So it's a parity argument to actually demonstrate that they're inconsistent if you apply their own understanding of a character trait or attribute, necessarily entailing that it must be expressed in order to be possessed. Then when it comes to mercy and forgiveness, they either have to bite the bullet, and then that would mean that the Son and the Spirit require the Father's, say, for example, forgiveness or mercy from eternity past, which is absurd. Or they would say, all right, Jake, you got a point. We're being inconsistent, and we got to get rid of this argument. And that's what I'm recommending that they actually do. So that's one example, right? Now, see, because I've got some notes here, and I want to make sure I hit on all of these points here. Okay, so there's one other point I have to note, is that there are different formulations of the argument. But I want to go down to the further premises. So premise 1, God being perfectly loving, we agree. That entailing that God actually must love another. We deny that in the same way that we would deny that him being perfectly forgiving or merciful entails that he necessarily must express that eternally. And Christians would agree with that, so then they have no really response at this point. So premise 2 we would deny. Then premise 3, necessarily any other God loves is either within God or is just part of God's creation. Well, we can agree with that, because God either loves something within God or outside of God. That's kind of trivial. It's not really anything we would have to necessarily disagree with. Premise 4, necessarily God was free to create. If you believe, as classical theists do and as Muslims do, that God had free will to create or not, then yeah, we're not going to have a problem with that. So we can agree with that. Premise 5, necessarily this object of love isn't part of God's creation. Well, no, we would probably deny that, because the question is, well, you're assuming that the object of God's love cannot be a part of his creation, because you're assuming that it must be eternally expressed. So no, we would disagree with that based on a rejection of premise 2. We can say, no, it can be expressed based on God's creation. And that's not a problem, because we don't believe that in order for a character trait to be possessed, it must be expressed. You need to give an argument for that. Premise 6, therefore, necessarily God must have another within him to love. No, that doesn't follow, because we reject premise 5. And then premise 7, therefore, necessarily, it is not the case that God is unipersonal, which obviously we would reject it as well, because that follows from premise 6, and we reject premise 6 because we reject premise 4. Premise 5. So that's a full breakdown of the argument. Let's take a look at another popular version, because there are different versions of this love argument. Here's another version of the love argument. Let me see here. Or let me read a quote from William Lane Craig, actually, because William Lane Craig is a proponent of... William Lane Craig is... And maybe I can actually pull up a video from him on this. I'm sure he's probably talked about it. I'm sure he's actually probably talked about this at some point. He's got to. Well, I'm going to read a quote from him, but I'm going to read a quote from him at some point, but I want to see if I can been happy to pull up a quick thing from him. So I'll take a look at that actually in a second. But so let me just read the quote from Craig here, what he says in his book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, which I actually have. I should have brought it out, but I've got the digital thing here. So it says, God must be perfect, which we agree with. Now, a perfect being must be a loving being, which is a character trait, which we agree with. For love, which is a character trait, is a moral perfection. Okay, fine. We've got no problem with that. God, therefore, must be a perfectly loving being. He must have the character trait of perfectly loving. Okay, so far so good. Now, it is of the very nature of love, character trait, to give oneself away, which is now an action. It's an expression of the possession. And so we're just going to fundamentally disagree with that. That's an assumption. Now he says love, which is a character trait, reaches out, meaning an action, to another person rather than centering it wholly in oneself. So if God is perfectly loving, which is a character trait, by his very nature, he must be giving himself in love to another, which is an action. So he just gives a simple argument. He assumes that if God possesses the attribute of being perfectly loving necessarily from eternity past, then he must express that to another. But there's no argument for it other than saying that it seems to fail if God either just simply loves himself or doesn't love anyone else. But there's no really argument for it. Now, so again, I just don't see any, from Craig's understanding, I don't see any necessary gap. I see a gap between saying that a possession of a character trait necessitates the expression of it. I don't see it anywhere. Don't see it anywhere in the argumentation, other than just asserting that that's what it requires. But you need to give an argument for it. And if you don't accept that for the other attributes, or character traits that God possesses, then it's not going to really fly. Now let's read from another. Let's read from another quote from Dr. Craig. He says, "Why not understand love as we understand God's other perfections? For example, I take it that God's perfect justice is not expressed until some moment after his creation rebels against him. If we can claim that God is just without having to express it until creation, then why not claim that a Unitarian God can be loving without creation?" So he's bringing up an example. He uses justice in this case. He anticipates the objection. So my response for all the Christians listening, my response is not absurd because Craig anticipates the objection, and then listen to how he responds to it. It's not enough to think of love as the disposition to love if some other person were to exist. Being loving is not merely the disposition to give oneself away to another, if that other existed. Being loving involves actually giving oneself away to another. So, this disposition cannot lie merely latent in God and never be actualized. It would follow then that a Unitarian God would have to create other persons necessarily, which is what your suggestion implies. But that contradicts what both Christians and Muslims believe about God's freedom in creating. Therefore, God must be a plurality of uncreated persons, which is what the doctrine of the Trinity affirms. So my argument comes down to this: love cannot be reduced to a mere disposition, though it is at least that, it is far more than that. Therefore, the Unitarian conception of God is inadequate. So, again, what he is saying is that, and let's focus on this, being loving involves actually giving oneself away to another. And he says that it necessarily does. Now, if this were the case, then he would have to say that it would be literally a contradiction in terms for God, or I'm sorry, not God, for a person who's stranded alone on an island to be loving or friendly or merciful or forgiving. They would have to actually say that in order for the argument to work, they would have to say that that is literally an incoherent concept. And again, it's based on a fundamental assumption, and they're not really giving much of an argument for it. Somebody else comments on this as well. Thinking about mercy, if being loving requires one to have an object which is being loved, then it could be argued that if God is merciful, he would require an object to which such mercy is shown. And again, this is found with Craig. So he again anticipates the objection and response. Sufyan, 1999, super sticker, really appreciate that. MashaAllah. May Allah reward you. So, now back to this issue here. Now, Craig's response to this, again, notice that he didn't actually respond adequately to show that there's a relevant difference between God's attribute of love and justice. He just reasserted the same principle. He didn't explain why justice would be different. Now, let's see if it's the same with mercy. He says retributive justice and mercy cannot be essential properties of God because they both entail the existence of other persons who can be punished or forgiven. That is to say, created persons in Orthodox theology has always held that creation is a contingent, freely willed act of God, so that creatures exist only contingently. So there are possible worlds in which God is neither punitive nor merciful, but he is nevertheless just and loving in such worlds. Then he goes on further to say, I'd say that while love is an essential property of God, mercy is a contingent property of God. The way God's love expresses itself toward fallen creatures, if they do exist, in the absence of any creatures, God is loving but not merciful. So notice now he has to bite the bullet, and he has to say that God, apart from creation, is actually not merciful. So he note that Craig doesn't backtrack, and because he noticed if he does, he'll be inconsistent. And if he says, well, yeah, God is still loving even though it's not expressed, he realizes that's a problem. So in order to be consistent, what he actually says is God, apart from creation, is not merciful, right? And he's also not just. Now, for us, that would seem a little bit absurd. Now, but if you want to take that position, go ahead. That's a cost that you're going to have to pay in that case. Now, again, he says, on the Unitarian view of God, on the Unitarian view, God is a person who does not give himself away essentially in love for another. He is focused essentially only on himself. Hence, he cannot be the most perfect being. This is sort of another form of the argument. But again, all of these ideas show that Craig is being inconsistent when it comes to character traits, right? Because with mercy, he actually admits that God cannot be merciful apart from creation. First, we would say that seems problematic. Second, what it shows is it seems to be an inconsistent methodology, because a character trait of loving and a character trait of mercy, in one case with it being loving, he says that it entails action. But in the case of mercy, right, he also says that it must refer to an action, and it cannot be to a mere character trait of possessing this attribute, right? But the problem is that, again, we can give the example of the person on the island, or you can think about other people. I can say that somebody is merciful even if I don't see them necessarily expressing it. Same thing with the person on the island. They can be merciful, loving, and friendly even if they don't have a person to express that, because they can possess the attribute without expressing it, such that if they were had the opportunity to express it, they would. And there's nothing contradictory with it. So when you say that something is a logical contradiction, it's like a squared circle or married bachelor. And that's a very high bar to actually demonstrate that saying that mercy or being all loving, being merciful or all loving or forgiving cannot be explained in terms of possession without expression, that possession necessarily entails expression. And so I just don't think that they're able to meet the burden of being able to demonstrate this. Now, I want to actually address another argument, which is from Richard Swinburne, which he actually uses based on something I talked in the previous stream about, the Nicene Creed. And this actually shows you, fellas, including Mr. Dr. White, if you choose to watch this later, that I'm not misrepresenting theology. Now, Richard Swinburne considers himself a part of Eastern Orthodox theology and affirms the Nicene Creed. And this is going to show how it's related to the Nicene Creed or the actual doctrine of eternal or divine processions. And look what I'm doing for you guys. I'm not trying to be cheap. I'm going to people like William Lane Craig. I'm going to people like Richard Swinburne. I'm going to the best arguments that are expressed in the philosophical literature, not just some Joe Schmo explaining it on YouTube. So let's listen to a different, slightly different argument from Mr. Richard Swinburne. So he says this, premise one. Let's take a look at here. Okay. So 1 second here. Let's see if I can find the exact quote here. Well, let's listen to what Swinburne says here. Perfection includes perfect love, which is a character trait. There's something profoundly imperfect in a solitary divine individual. If such an individual is love, meaning has the character trait of being loving in the highest degree or best way, and again, I'm quoting directly from this article. The only reason I'm not mentioning the name is because it was given to me, and I don't want to reveal that. I don't think the material has been released yet. But if anyone has a question, I will mention it later on. Inshallah, God willing, when the article comes out. So a divine individual's love, which is a character trait, has to be manifested, meaning in the action of loving another. So he makes a similar argument that says, in order for God to be all loving, the attribute or possession of it can only be made sense of if it's expressed. So again, he makes a similar argument, Richard Swinburne. That's just an intro, but we're going to show where he slightly deviates here. And, well, not deviates, but he makes a further argument, which Craig wouldn't accept because Craig doesn't believe in this portion of the Nicene Creed, or this idea that the Son and the Spirit are begotten and spirated of the Father. So he says this: since God could not beget something better than himself, for nothing is better than God, then the one whom he did beget, this is actually from Augustine. Let me read the one where he quotes Augustine. So he says, Augustine wrote that if the Father wished to beget the Son, that is, cause the Son to exist. Note, cause the Son to exist. This is Swinburne here. And was unable to do it, he would have been weak. If he was able to do it, but did not wish to, he would have failed to do it because of envy. That is, because he wished to be the only divine person. A solitary God would have been an ungenerous God, and so no God. So he's arguing off of the divine processions. If God can beget another person within the Godhead, and he chooses not to, that would be selfish. And he should do it because it would be the best action, or a loving action. So this is where he goes into it further. He says, the Father is perfect. Premise 1. Premise 2, either the Father has or lacks this combination of qualities, the desire to beget an equal and the power to beget an equal. Now, first of all, I would say, yeah, God does, quote unquote, lack the power to beget an equal, because a necessary attribute of God is aseity. And if he begets something, that thing cannot possess aseity, and therefore it cannot be equal, because aseity is a great making property. So I would deny premise 2 anyway, that God cannot beget an equal. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. He begets not, nor is he begotten. Now, premise 3, if he has both of those qualities, then the Father begets an equal. Okay, so if he has the ability and desire, then he will beget the equal, basically. If he lacked the desire to beget an equal, then a father would be envious. He would be, jealous. Premise 5, if he lacked the power to beget an equal, then the father would be to some degree weak. No, he wouldn't, because I would say that aseity is necessarily a great making property, and to beget something, that thing that's begotten can't possess aseity, and therefore cannot be equal to the thing that begets it. So I would agree with that. I would disagree with that you're weak if you can't beget another God or another person within God. Premise 6, a perfectly loving being is neither envious nor to any degree weak. Well, I would agree with that, but I wouldn't agree with the conclusion, because I would reject the 2 other premises within it. Therefore, the Father begets an equal. So he's trying to say that therefore the Father would necessarily beget an equal. Now, here is another form of the argument, basically. It goes like this, another way to express it. Suppose the Father is the only divine self, the only person. That's premise 1. Premise 2, divinity implies perfect goodness. Well, we could agree with that. Premise 3, a perfectly good being must do the uniquely best possible action available to him whenever such an action is available. Okay, that's somewhat, we could think about that, whether or not we want to challenge that, but we'll leave that for now. Premise 4, the uniquely best possible action which is available to a solitary divine self is to cause there to be another divine self. So he says the best possible action for a solitary self like the Father is to beget or cause, and he uses the word cause, right? A second divine self. So again, I'm not misrepresenting the creed. This is just further example of that. We would say, no, that's false. Why would we say that the best action would be to beget or cause another divine self? That's an assumption. I reject that that's even possible because he couldn't be equal, because he wouldn't have aseity, which is a great making property. So the whole argument, Swinburne's entire argument isn't going to work because it wouldn't be a divine self. It would be less than divine because of the fact, right? Sorry, I just dropped my famous pen here. Because it wouldn't possess aseity. But obviously, I would have to give an argument for that. I'm not making just an assumption or assertion, but people have heard me argue it before. Just giving it as a response to this at the moment. And then let's see what premise was I on here? Oh, premise 5. So therefore, the Father must cause there to be a second divine self. Well, no, it's not going to follow because I don't accept premise 4. And then premise 6. Therefore, there is a divine self in addition to the Father. Premise 7, but this is impossible, right? And then premise 8, therefore it is not the case that the Father is the only divine self. So it tries to argue that begetting or causing another person to exist is the best possible action because God must do the best possible action. Therefore, he must do this. Therefore, there must be another divine person. Fundamental assumption is that causing another, throw up those pens, guys, but it's irrelevant. This whole argument's irrelevant. You know that? You know what? I should just shut the whole stream down. I'm done. The whole thing is irrelevant, guys. The whole thing's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. You guys would like that, right? How would they respond if I said, listen, William McLean Craig, your whole argument is irrelevant. I'm done. I'm out. I've just won a debate. I've run a discussion. Have a nice day. Assalamu alaikum. No, it's silly. So, back to reality. Snap back to reality. So, fundamental assumption is that it's even possible to beget another that is equal. Well, I would say no, because aseity is a great making property such that begetting or causing another, the thing that's begotten, would actually lack. One second here, would actually lack aseity and therefore wouldn't be equal to the one that begets or the one that's unbegotten, which is the Father. So that's one problem. Second problem is it assumes, again, that in order for God to be perfectly loving, he must beget another or must cause another divine person to exist. Well, I think that's absurd. I just don't think that there's necessarily any evidence for it. It's just sort of an assertion. Another thing to consider is, which is backing up slightly to Craig's formulation of the argument. Notice that Craig's formulation of the argument doesn't even necessitate a Trinity, because at best it gets you to a binitarian God, or there being two persons, because God could love another without there being three persons. So with Craig's issue, how does he get to a third person? Right? Now, one way that he might try to get to a third person, or that Richard Swinburne tries to get to a third person, right, is when he says this. Depends on the very simple moral intuitions that perfect love requires total sharing with an equal and requires cooperating in spreading that love further, so that anyone you love has someone else to love and be loved by. So now he tries to move from the second person, which he can't even establish or prove, to a third divine person to say that perfect love not only requires, notice this, notice the metaphysical commitments that this requires. It doesn't only require that perfectly loving, which is a character trait, necessitates an expression of loving another, which is a second person. Now it's saying that it requires expressing it to a third person necessarily, so that it necessarily entails a third divine person. And the argument for justification for that is to say that just merely loving another isn't perfect love. It's not enough. you need to now, after loving another, cooperate in love with that second person by giving it to a third so that you don't seem greedy, like you only want to have love between two people. Again, it's just an assumption. What's the argument for it? It's just an assertion. Why should I buy into that? No, it's false. You don't really have an argument for it. So again, this is even more absurd, right? Because we can somewhat understand why they want to say, oh, there needs to be another person or a creation to be all loving, right? With the second person. But now imagine the island example. Richard Swinburne and Craig may argue this as well, not entirely sure, that let's start out with God first and then we'll give the island example. It is insufficient, or it's not perfectly loving unless there's a third person to love. Even loving another, which is a second person, is still not enough. It's not sufficient. So perfectly loving doesn't only entail loving another, it entails loving two others and cooperating in love to love another with another, which is absurd. Why should I buy into that? It's just taking this word of all loving or being perfectly loving, a character trait, assuming that possession necessarily entails expression, not only to another, but to others. So imagine this on an island. Now let's take it down to a human example. Not only are they saying that somebody can't be merciful or loving apart from loving or expressing that, being lonely on an island, they're actually saying, even if I was alone with my wife on an island, I could not be perfectly loving because of the fact that I have a sort of jealousness, or my love is restricted only to her and vice versa. We would need a third person to love on the island in order for it to be perfectly loving, which is absurd, because now you can think about this. Think of the Christian narrative with Adam and Eve. Adam alayhi salam and Eve. If you take a traditional narrative that they were the first humans or Homo sapiens, right? And I think Craig and Swinburne would accept this. I'm not entirely sure, but for Christians anyway, and Muslims as well. Adam and Eve, first humans, there's no other humans there. Now, would we say that Adam alayhi salam could not be perfectly loving to his wife because there was not a third person for them to love, or a human for them to love? Now, I know they can argue, well, God is a person and they had the ability to love God. Fair enough. But I'm simply using them as an example to say they were trapped on an island and they couldn't love anyone else. Will we say that Adam alayhi salam, or peace be upon him, could not possibly be perfectly loving because they don't have a third person to love? I mean, come on. This is just, I can understand somewhat the intuition to want to say, okay, well, on first glance, we want to look at loving another. But when you try to stretch it to a third person, now you're really stretching it. And then the question is, why is 3 the magic number? Why is 3 the magic number? Meaning, why do you stop at 3? And the reason why I'm going to ask this, right, is because, let's say this. So here's another argument, right? So here's an argument. Here's a further question about why only 3. But before I get to that, somebody did send a super chat who I want to address before I get into the 4th layer. What are we on? I don't know if we're at the 4th or 5th layer of debunking this bad argument. F. Leonardo said, pretty close to 10K. I think he's talking about my followers. I've got almost 8K right now. MashaAllah. Also glad to see you in Clubhouse. I think a logic class would be beneficial to those in Clubhouse making illogical claims. Yeah, so for those who don't know, who don't follow me on Twitter, I've recently joined Clubhouse at the expense today of a few brain cells. Sorry to say. I had to take a long ghusl after my Clubhouse session with a whole bunch of internet atheists. This was really bad. It's like they don't even understand what a logical contradiction is. And to be fair, it's not just atheists, it's Christians and even other theists as well. So it's just really unfortunate. But So thanks for that super chat. Really do appreciate it. May Allah bless you. Now, so check me out on Clubhouse if you use the app and you want to check me out there. Now, so I want to do a recap. I presented several layers of arguments already to debunk this claim. First level of argument was to say, what's the assumption that a possession of a character trait or attribute necessitates the expression of it? Put the ball in their court. Watch how they drop the ball. Second point is, right? The second point was to say that not only that, I would argue that no, it doesn't. And you can give examples like the island example and show that, well, there's nothing actually contradictory in the terms. It's not like true by definition or a square circle or married bachelor, and give the island example to say, well, it doesn't seem absurd or inherently contradictory to say that, a lonely person on an island could be a friendly guy, meaning that he possesses the attribute even if he doesn't have the ability to express it. But if he were introduced with somebody else, he would express it. So that's the second level. Third level is to show a parity argument with something like mercy or justice or being forgiven, and showing that they either have to do two things: either deny, as Craig does, that God is necessarily forgiving, which is a huge blow. And then we say, well, my God is necessarily forgiving and yours isn't, and necessarily just and necessarily merciful. And because of the fact that they cannot show how actually they're not going to accept that forgiveness. See, they either have to accept that possessing the attribute of forgiveness entails forgiving another, in which case they'd have to have something within God to forgive. Either that or it would make creation necessary. Or they would have to say, okay, no, because that would be problematic. We either are going to abandon the argument because we realize, it's inconsistent, or they have to abandon that mercy, justice, and forgiveness and things of that are necessary attributes of God, which I would also say is problematic. Now, because then Craig's God is not necessarily all merciful. Now, again, because he's just simply assuming that mercy has to be attributed or defined as an action and can't be possessed without expressed, which again, it just assumes the whole thing. So that was the third point. And then the fourth point was going to other forms of the argument, which is Richard Swinburne's argument, which is based on the doctrine of divine processions or causing another person. I would say that no, we would reject that, first of all, because he can't beget an equal, because begetting basically entails that the thing that's begotten isn't say or possess aseity. Aseity is a necessary attribute of God, which I've argued for many times in other places and other videos, and therefore he couldn't beget an equal. And so therefore, it doesn't make sense to say that he necessarily has to beget an equal. So that whole thing's not going to work. And Craig doesn't accept it either, because he thinks that actually begetting someone results in the thing that's begotten not being equal. So Craig would actually back me up on that and deny Swinburne's argument, because he thinks that the Nicene Creed and the doctrine of divine processions are false. He thinks it degrades the perfection and status of the Son and the Spirit being equal to God the Father. And so then again, the other problem with Swinburne's argument was assuming that the best possible action for a single divine person would be to beget another person, which would be equal to him. No, that's just false. What's the argument for it? There's no argument for it, really, other than just kind of assuming it. Now, let's go to, now we're at the question of why only 3. So how do they get to stopping at 3? Why is 3 the magic number? Because Craig and the others, they only really get to 2 persons. They don't even really pull off the Trinity anyway. But now remind you that they say that, so not only this, not only do they say that they try to get not only from 2 persons, but to get 3 persons. So they say, not only does a character trait or an attribute necessarily entail an expression of it to another, but it also entails a third person to share the expression of that with another, because otherwise it would be just sort of jealous or envious or selfish. It would be selfish to not want to share that with another third person. So he tries to, and which is just, honestly, I don't know how you can really take that argument seriously. It's just based on an assumption which there's really no good evidence or intuition for, I don't think. And then when we go to the third person, right? So after the third person, the question would be, well, if it's the best possible action for a third person to manifest or beget the third person, why couldn't we ask the same about the fourth person? And so Swinburne anticipates this objection, and then this is his sort of argument in response to it. So here's Swinburne's argument, because again, notice that my responses are represented in the literature by these philosophers and theologians who anticipate these responses. So they're not completely out of left field. Otherwise, you don't think that your Christian scholars are really making much sense. Now, I do want to address one comment in the chat. Original Win, that's my dude. Wouldn't Swinburne say that since aseity is an extrinsic property and hence not great making, since he disagrees with necessity? I don't know, because I haven't. He might go down Dr. Josh's line of thinking, but again, this is my critique of Swinburne's argument. I obviously don't buy into that. I don't think that aseity is extrinsic, and I do think it's great making. So I'm responding it from my point of view of what the premises I would reject. Of course, Swinburne accepts it because he doesn't think that the property of being begotten makes the son less than the father. So obviously I'm not claiming that, but I'm saying from my perspective, it's problematic to lack aseity and still be fully divine in the same way that the father is that is ase. Now, so, and the problem now here that Swinburne's going to try to address is, why are there only three persons? Why not a fourth person? If it's so good to have and share love amongst persons, why not a fourth person and a fifth person and 100 persons? So he says this: premise one, suppose that the first person spreads love in a way that entails bringing about a fourth person. Premise two, necessarily a divine person exists inevitably. Premise three, this fourth divine person would exist inevitably. Premise four, necessarily any act of a divine person is either an act of essence, i.e. one which he must perform because he is divine, or an act of will, meaning one which he freely chooses to perform and which he could have refrained from performing, so meaning that he didn't have to, but not both. Premise five, whereas the production of a second and third person would be acts of essence. So here's the whole point. This is the crux of the premise here. Swinburne is claiming the production of a second and third person would be acts of essence, meaning they're necessary, by the first person being essentially good or loving because he must spread his love. Production of any further divine person, meaning a fourth divine person, would not be an act of essence, since it wouldn't be required by spreading love. And again, this is the assumption that we're attacking, and we're saying, why not? Why? Why should we think that? Premise six, this fourth divine person exists because of an act of will by the first divine person, which is his claim. Premise seven, the existence of this fourth divine person was not inevitable, meaning it didn't have to happen. Premise eight, but this is impossible. Therefore, premise nine, it is not the case that the first divine person spreads the love by bringing about a fourth divine person. So basically the argument is, well, it's not necessary for love to be spread to a fourth divine person, and therefore he wouldn't do it, or he's not obliged to do it. So again, it doesn't really seem like there's much of a good argument for it, other than it seems like it's an arbitrary stopping point for the fourth divine person. I don't see why we couldn't say, well, if actually, I'm not even going to make that objection yet. Because I'm going to read a quote from, because what I'm going to show is actually not only do many Christians who are Unitarians disagree with this argument, but many Trinitarian Christians disagree with this argument. And Brother Original Win, what do you call it? Productions agrees. He doesn't think that this is actually a good argument. So Sahih Luke, he talks a lot in my comment section, but honestly, let's just address this. I have a video titled "Why Not More Than 4 Persons?" proving why it's impossible for there to be a fourth person or more. It can't be debunked. It addresses Ijaz's and Shabir's question. Well, I'm happy to check out your video. You can post it in the chat. But again, it's merely a claim. You're not actually proving. When you say that you're proving that 3 is the magic number, sorry, not buying it. And even most Christian philosophers wouldn't buy that. So I'm going to show that further. So I think that's enough. There are other formulations of the argument, but that's enough for to get the point across. And I've already been going for an hour. I'm going to go for another probably 20 minutes to a half hour and get to a couple last points here on debunking this argument. So again, here's something to note, that even Christians that are Trinitarians don't necessarily agree with the argument, because this is an argument. Yes, Sahih Luke is actually da'if. Yeah, that's true. He's actually weak. He's not sound. He's not authentic. So let me point something out here, is that people like Original Win, who is a Trinitarian Christian and a Catholic, and many Catholics think that the Trinity is a matter of divine or special revelation. So these are trying to give a priori, or what's called arguments that are based on reason prior to revelation, so that they're trying to give a case for the Trinity not only being known through reason alone, but saying that it's necessary through reason alone, which is a very strong claim that people, if people are honest and really in touch with philosophical literature, will realize how big of a claim that is, that actually Christians cannot possibly bear that. And many Christian theologians would agree that the Trinity is not a matter of general revelation, that creation necessitates it, but also that it is necessarily known only through special revelation, because it's a mystery, meaning that it's something that it was unknown and then had to have been revealed, right? And another reason that we know this is because the Jews themselves, if that were the case, the Jews themselves, and even great patriarchs of the Old Testament like Musa or Moses alayhi salam, who many Christians will admit didn't believe or affirm with their mind in a Trinity, that they knew that 3 persons in the Godhead exist, they would literally be claiming that the Jews are all along, prior to the revelation formally of the Trinity in the incarnation of Christ, believed in actually a false and incoherent God, which doesn't make any sense, because if you're trying to show either the incoherence of a Unitarian God, or probabilistically that it seems problematic, then you would have to make the claim that either all of the ancient Jews actually knew about the Trinity and they affirmed it, or you're saying that they didn't affirm it and therefore they were following a conception of God that was fundamentally flawed and incoherent or improbable on reasonable standards. Meaning if somebody approached them with it prior to the incarnation, they could have been jammed. They could have said, oh, here's an argument for the Trinity, you're stuck. No, that's ridiculous. So, and again, here's the ridiculous part. Let's see this is what Sahih Luke has to say. Moses and Abraham literally affirmed multiple divine persons. I'm sorry, but most Christian scholars would reject that. You can believe that if you want, buddy, but I'm sorry, but most most Christian scholars and even other scholars would disagree with that. The evidence doesn't bear it out because we don't actually have evidence, clear evidence of the ancient Jews prior to what you call Second Temple Judaism, like the people of Noah and Abraham, explicitly affirming a Trinitarian God or a multiplicity of persons. And that's why I saw, hey, Luke, I'm going to blast you, dude, because you've actually begged me on email to call you. This guy, imagine this. This guy actually begged me to call him, saying that he would pay me to actually speak to him privately. Get out of here. And now you want to bring this dishonest stuff up? Sorry, I can't respect you, dude. This is dishonest nonsense that you're bringing to the table. Anyway, you can chill in the chat section and peddle your conspiracy theories that the ancient Jews prior to Second Temple Judaism actually believed, and the patriarchs of the Old Testament actually believed explicitly in a plurality of persons or Trinity. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So now getting back to the point is that not all Christians, even the Trinitarians, agree that this is a good argument, because they say that the Trinity was a mystery, meaning that it was something that was formerly unknown that then was later revealed in the New Testament in virtue of Christ or the incarnation. And if that's the case, then it refutes that it can be necessarily known or entailed merely from God being all loving. And so it also would go against, I believe, a dogma of the Catholic Church, which affirms this. And so that would be a problem definitely for Catholics. Because many people want to say, no, it's not something, as Dr. White in my debate did. See, Dr. James White, who's a Protestant as well, he said, Jake, see, the only one of my 5 arguments that I've brought up that he actually engaged with, which he was honest about, I said that the Trinity cannot possibly be known apart from special revelation, meaning it cannot be known purely from a philosophical standpoint from general revelation. He actually said, Jake, you're actually right about that, and Christians should affirm that. Right? He actually said that. And he said, and he thinks that that's what makes it beautiful. Now, I'm not going to attack that, but I'm going to say even people like Dr. White admit that it's a matter of special revelation, not general revelation. And one of the scriptures that I brought up actually in the debate with James White was Romans chapter 1. Now, what I'm going to do here, if I'm able to do this, let's see if I'm going to be able to actually bring this up here, guys. How can I do this? All right, bring it up here. Got it. So let me share my screen and show that this claim actually contradicts their own scripture. And James White, I think, would agree with this. So watch this. How the claim that the Trinity can be known in creation itself contradicts their own Bible in Romans chapter 1. So I've got the screen shared here for you guys. Romans chapter 1 starts off with a greeting, longing to go to Rome. So we go down here to God's wrath. Start at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their own righteousness suppress the truth. Now listen to what the truth is that people are suppressing, according to Paul, the author of Romans. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Okay, so what can be known about God is plain to them, which is the thing that they're suppressing, the truth that they're suppressing, because God has shown it to them. Now, what has God shown to them? For his invisible attributes. And what are those attributes? Namely, his eternal power and divine nature, meaning the existence of God and the fact that he has power, right? Certain of these attributes have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So in creation, and they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So notice that there's nothing in there about a triune God being known from general revelation or merely from creation. What is said is they know that it's the truth that God exists and that God has certain attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature. But it says absolute, and notice, and also here's the thing to note, that the divine nature for most Christians is actually, in a sense, you know that God exists, but they don't ascribe certain attributes to it. But that's a whole nother issue. I don't want to get into the whole essence-energy distinction. But the point is, there's nothing in there in Romans 1 about a Trinity. So did Paul leave out the fact that no, they also should know that a Trinity exists? Obviously not. Obviously not. So let me address this guy. Let me address this guy. Let me address this guy here, Mr. Daif Luke. This guy, he's dishonest. Either he's dishonest or he's so confused. Scholarship affirms, as I stated, they recognize as the Old Testament explicitly God is not unipersonal, and there are multiple divine persons according to Moses and Abraham. Facts. No, buddy, scholarship is not on your side about that. Even if you want to read that into the Old Testament, even if you want to make that claim, the scholars do not claim that the people in the Old Testament actually saw it that way. At the very most, what they typically will say, that in light of the revelation or the mystery of Christ and the Trinity being revealed in Christ, with New Testament lens and eyes in virtue of the incarnation of Christ Jesus, you can look back at the Old Testament and see certain shadows of a multi-personal God. But most of them don't go as so far to claim that they actually believed in this from creation alone, apart from special revelation and apart and before the revelation of Christ, the incarnate one. I mean, it's just, honestly, if you actually believe that, Luke, I'm sorry, but you're deceiving yourself, my friend. There's no Sahih Luke, more like fabricated Luke, yeah, Da'if Luke, yeah, or Mabdua Luke. So anyway, not all Christians agree with that, and I'm going to show an example of that, which is Dr. Ryan Mullins, who I've had on my show many times, but my good Catholic friends, many of them would not agree with this. By the fact that it's a mystery, and also the fact that it's through special revelation, not through general revelation, as even somebody that I debated like Dr. James White would say that no, it's not known through through general revelation. Sorry. And then lastly, Romans 1 denies it. There's nothing in the Trinity there about knowing the Trinity from general revelation alone. Paul doesn't say, oh, they should actually know that the Trinity exists. He says that God exists in his power and divine nature. Nothing about a Trinity. And if you guys constantly make the distinction between the nature and the persons, the what, which is the nature, and the whose, which are the persons, then that means that you know the nature or the essence of God, but not that there's three persons that share it. So if you want to affirm that distinction and you say, oh, the Muslims all the time conflate being in person. Well, then if you're saying that the nature necessarily entails the persons, then you're conflating the two. Sorry, that's not the argument of Romans 1. If you affirm that, then you're either delusional or dishonest. Sorry to tell you and be so blunt with the audience here. Now, this is going to be the last point that I think I'm going to address here. Actually, one quick point. So, yeah, like I said, the Jews, for the most part, didn't have cognizant knowledge of that. Another thing to consider is, just throwing it out here, it's not like a big refutation, but polytheism, or the idea that you can have multiple gods. You can have multiple gods that love each other perfectly. This is theoretically possible. Multiple gods who are not just separate divine persons, but also multiple gods that love each other perfectly. And so we can sort of run a parity argument for polytheism. Say, well, it necessitates another God, not just another person. So this is the other thing, is that they're saying, which I think actually is an important point here. They're saying that the attribute of being perfectly loving not only necessitates loving another, but it necessitates loving another person, not another being, which is another assumption. Why is that the case? Because I can give an example of this. Think of the island example. Even if we grant them the three, we've got Jake on an island, Jake's wife on an island, and I'll just use another anonymous person so I don't get in trouble. So a third person, and we all share love, not in a, don't get it twisted, not in a marriage type of way. But so we all share love equally amongst the three persons, but those are three beings, not only three persons. What's incoherent about it? You are now moving from loving another to specifying that loving another entails loving another person and not being. Notice that, which is another metaphysical assumption. Is just adding on more and more layers, which I think are so indefensible that any reasonable person, including Trinitarians who are really in tune and honest with themselves, would deny this argument. Okay. And then, so now what I want to go to is Mullins' paper here. Let me just try to pull it up real quick. 1 second here. Let me just pull it up real quick. But while I'm doing that, is there anything else that I need to address in the chat? I don't think so. Let me see here. Divine. Just trying to pull up this. Okay, I got it. So here's another response to the whole love thing, and this is going to sort of cap it off, and then I'm going to give a recap of, try to give a recap of everything I just said. Sorry, guys, I tend to repeat myself a lot because I think that repetition really helps people, because I'm giving so many layers of response to this argument of totally debunking it that I think sometimes the points could get lost on some of you guys. Okay. Just trying to pull up my notes here real quick. Let's see if I can find it real quick. I got so many notes on this, just this one paper here. And this, again, this is from a Trinitarian Christian, Dr. Mullins, who I love. That's my guy. And this is on somewhat a formulation of Swinburne's argument. And he's responding to somebody named William Hasker. You can find this in his paper on Hasker on the Divine Processions, which you can also find in sort of a detailed explanation of the article on my channel. I interviewed Dr. Mullins on this specific paper. He says, in response to Hasker, even William Hasker, who's a Trinitarian Christian who uses our argument, notes that this argument is not a proof. Instead, he refers to it as a plausibility argument. The intent of the argument is merely to make it plausible why there could be three persons. However, he notes that it is hard to decisively refute the idea that a single divine person might have the universe as an adequate object of its love. And then further, he says, unfortunately, for Hasker, the Richard argument is incredibly unpersuasive, for it does little to establish even the plausibility of the claim that perfect love must consist of three persons. And then he gives a counter to it. Consider the case of a single person, God, whose adequate object of love is God himself, meaning himself. The object of love is himself. Is there anything imperfect about this, he asks? The self-love of a perfect being is not obviously imperfect, since the object of its love is perfect. Further, the self-love of a perfect being would be proportionate to the worthiness of the object, meaning God loving himself. God, the expression of the love is perfect because God is perfectly loving, meaning in the sense of if God expresses his love, the expression of his love is perfect. And the object of his love, if it is himself, the object is perfect. So the expression is perfect and the object is perfect. He says, we often consider love, right? He says, we often consider love to be imperfect if the love directed towards the object of the beloved, meaning the thing loved, is disproportionate with the worthiness of the object. Example, when a person loves money more than people. In the case of divine self-love, the object of the beloved, which is himself, is in perfect proportion to the worthiness of the object. So it is not obvious that divine love must generate more divine persons in order to be perfect. Nor is it persuasive that the divine love must stop at three persons. The claim from Hasker is that adding a fourth person would not be of any great gain to perfecting divine love. He says, so Mullins, just a recap of what Mullins said. First, Hasker, who uses the argument, admits that it's not a proof, but it's a plausibility argument of how there could be more than one person. Second, he says it's incredibly unpersuasive, even on a plausibility account. Third, he says that a single person could love himself eternally and it could be perfect because the object, which is himself, is perfect and the expression is also perfect. So there's nothing contradictory about that because it's proportionate to the object. Now he's saying about the thing that I brought up is how do you stop at three persons? He says, nor is it persuasive that the divine love must stop at three persons, which is what I've argued. The claim from Hasker is that adding a fourth person would not be of any great gain to perfecting divine love. So it wouldn't add anything, which is the same thing that Professor Richard Swinburne mentioned. Mullins says in the same way that I said, surely that is not obvious. Assume that each divine person is of infinite value. So each divine person, because it's equal, is of infinite value. And that each divine person offers perfect love. So each divine person offers perfect love. It would seem that adding another perfect person or being, an object of infinite value and love, would be a pretty big benefit. So if another person is infinitely great and his love would be perfect, then it would seem like a pretty big benefit, Mullins says. The benefit would be infinite. It would seem that an infinite benefit should persuade the Father, the fount of divinity, so appealing to this thing of Swinburne of causing other persons to exist, to eternally generate more than two persons. If the gain is infinite, it is difficult to discern why the Father should stop generating more divine persons at any point. So not out of the fourth person, he'll never stop generating persons. So this plausibility argument is unpersuasive. It does not plausibly explain why perfect divine love must stop at three persons. He says not only does it not explain why you don't get a fourth person, but it doesn't explain why you wouldn't get an infinite amount of persons. And so if there's no stopping point, then, and this is something that Dr. Bo Branson actually agrees with. So Dr. Branson, Sahih Luke, disagrees with this argument and says it's false because of the fact that he agrees with what Mullins says here. It doesn't seem plausible of how you get to 3 as the magic number and how you perfectly stop at 3. And he actually argues that this argument would result in an infinite amount of divine persons. An actual infinite amount of divine persons is metaphysically impossible and therefore is false. And so therefore, don't get me wrong, Dr. Branson believes in the Trinity, but he also believes it's firmly rooted in special revelation. And he also believes in another argument, which I've debated him on, and I will discuss with him actually a little bit. I want to do a full discussion on it, but it's an entirely different argument. And the reason he uses an entirely different argument is because he thinks that this one is fundamentally flawed, because it doesn't make sense of how you actually stop at exactly 3 persons. So now, that's the end of it. So I want to do a quick recap, guys, of everything that I just said. So, but while I do that, I just want to make sure that I didn't miss anything in the chats with you guys. Just want to make sure that I am not missing anything here in the chat with you guys. 1 second here. Trying to multitask, guys. I'm doing the best I can. So cut me some slack, would you? Let me see here. 1 second. So I'm also trying to pull something up at the same time. 1 second. Because I actually do want to play a small clip, if I can, from William Lane Craig showing that I'm not strawmanning him, that he actually makes this argument. Even though I quoted directly from him, video is always good. People like to do that. Okay. So 1 second here, guys. And I do apologize I didn't have all of this stuff ready because I'm trying to I got caught up at work, unfortunately. So give me just a second here. 1 second here, guys. But anyway, what do you guys think of my complete debunking of this? Am I delusional, or have I completely debunked this argument? What do you guys think? Have I debunked this argument or what? Even a Christian said, Catholic, Original Win, who's a mod, he said, thank you for defending the Catholic position. So that's what I'm telling you. Even a lot of Christians don't agree. So, yeah, and just one quick announcement, guys. Do consider clicking that join button to help support my work. A lot of time and effort goes into reading this academic material. I'm not just listening to random Christians on the internet. I try to read their material, present it in the best possible form that they have, and then try to debunk it and say, well, you got a point here, or tell you where I think it's wrong. So consider if you enjoy these type of videos, which I feel are quite unique. I don't feel that many people are doing these type of streams, and I hope that you guys find them beneficial. If you do, definitely consider clicking that join button, or consider clicking the pinned message on YouTube, which is for Patreon link. And if you do that, it will definitely help me and benefit me, inshallah. But if you do that as well, you will receive a monthly members only live stream access access to where I do monthly members only live streams, and we get to chat and just ask questions and have a good time. So that's also another thing to consider. But if you can't do that, definitely click that thumbs up button, guys. If you haven't clicked that thumbs up button for this video yet after an hour and a half, shame on you. What are you doing? How could you watch an hour and a half of the Muslim Metaphysician and not click that thumbs up button? So definitely consider clicking that thumbs up button. Consider clicking the subscribe button if you haven't subscribed already. What are you doing, man? It's the Muslim Metaphysician. I mean, come on, let's do it. And then definitely share it. Share it with your friends and colleagues, your family members. Share it on your social media platforms, no matter how big or small. These are things that you guys can do to help support me without becoming patrons or YouTube members. And those are the very important things to further the message that's being spread here. I want to get this video out to as many people as possible. So when Christians come with this argument, well, that God can't be all loving if he doesn't have another person to love from eternity past, this is the video. Muslim Metaphysician has created the video and standard of debunking that. And you guys need to send them this video when they do that. So make sure anytime a Christian brings that up, say, have you heard of my friend, the Muslim Metaphysician? He did a whole stream explaining the argument, debunking it step by step, giving 5 layers of explanation as to why it doesn't work, reading even from Christian scholars and the Bible as to why it doesn't work. So, yeah, I want to make this video the standard that Muslims can share, appreciate for themselves if they had any questions about, and be able to share it with Christians and other Muslims as well that may have questions or that may be persuaded by the argument. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to try to play a video from Craig here. I'm not sure. Let's see if this one actually works. Let me see here. Well, unfortunately, I'm not able to find or track down that video. So maybe I'll play it next time on another stream, or maybe Craig doesn't even have it. I could have sworn I've seen a video from him on this, but I could just be totally making it up, guys. I've had a long day. I've been on Clubhouse all day with atheists, and oh man. I've got love for the atheists. I got love for the Christians. I got love for everybody, but the atheists, I must say, are some of the most difficult people to deal with, especially for a long period of time. It gets to a certain point where it's like, oh, subhanallah. What can he say? What can he say? He's got to have a nice meal, nice cup of tea, take a nice shower, and calm down, cool off, take a little break from the action. But yeah, guys, so I hope that you appreciated this explanation. I want to give it just a quick summary. And again, I've made like 10 different layers of points. First is put the argument on them, ask them to demonstrate why it's necessary. If they say, oh, it's not necessary, but it's, probable, so they're using that as a plausibility, show even why we should even think that it probabilistically says that. Then secondly, show that, no, you can give examples of a person on a lonely island to show, and I want this phrase to be known, that the possession doesn't necessarily entail expression. So possession of an attribute or character trait doesn't necessarily entail the expression of it. And they're making that claim, and they need to provide an argument for it rather than just simply restating it and asserting it. We can give examples of the island example, and it doesn't seem contradictory, because if they're saying it's contradictory, they need to say that it's literally a square circle to say that somebody is loving without having another person to love. I don't think that it's at all obvious, and it's kind of ridiculous. Then we give a parity argument with things like forgiving, mercy, justice, etc., to show that they either have to abandon that these arguments are actually necessary, which fine, then we say, oh, my God's greater than yours then, because mine is necessarily merciful, and mine is necessarily forgiving, and mine is necessarily just. Again, assuming that those attributes necessarily, the possession of them, entail the expression or necessitate the expression. Again, if you want to be consistent to make that claim, you have to provide the same argument. Otherwise, you're going to have to say that the persons of the Trinity are merciful to each other and require forgiveness from eternity past, which is also absurd. And again, we can use counterexamples with the island as well. Just checking off my list here. We went through the different formulations of the argument, showed that Craig's example doesn't work. It doesn't even get you to a Trinity. It only supposedly gets you to an extra person. But why 3? So note that it says it requires. So then Swinburne tries to go further. Says that his version based on the doctrine of divine processions not only requires loving another for you to be perfectly loving, but it requires 2 more. So it requires 3 persons. Again, additional added metaphysical assumption, which is absurd. We don't have to accept it. It's just a presupposition. It's just an assertion. And also that's based on thinking that God can beget an equal, meaning that something can be begotten and lack aseity and be yet equal to something that's unbegotten. You would reject that. Also, it assumes that 3 is the magic number. There's no really good reason for why you don't get a 4th person, which neither Hasker nor Swinburne really have a good argument for it. And I think Dr. Mullins points that out, because if you have a person which is of infinite worth and can express infinite love, then it would seem like the best action to beget or cause another person, in which case you would have an actual infinite number of persons, because you can't actually stop the chain, which is what Dr. Branson mentions, who is another Trinitarian Christian. And so an actual infinite amount of persons is metaphysically impossible. Therefore, the argument doesn't work, because it leads to an absurdity. Then the issue with Mullins bringing up the loving the God, a Unitarian God loving himself, doesn't seem metaphysically impossible or absurd, because the object of love and the expression of the love, both of them are perfect, because the object is love, so it's proportionate to the object, and the expression of it is also perfect. Nothing incoherent about that whatsoever. Also, what was the other point? See, now with Swinburne, and Swinburne actually flirted with tritheism, so I don't want to necessarily say with him, but what these Christians are saying is that not only does the idea of being perfectly loving necessitate loving another, it necessitates that the another is not a person. That is not a being, but is a person. Otherwise, if you say, well, loving another is sufficient, and it could be a being instead of a person, then you're saying, and you're actually providing argumentation for the possibility or plausibility or even the necessity of 3 gods or polytheism. So it's another additional metaphysical commitment that they have to make, that it not only gets them to loving another, but that the another is in the category of person and not being, which is, wow, just really. And I came up with that. I thought of that one recently. So I honestly don't believe how they could possibly believe that. And again, how you stop at 4 persons doesn't seem like any of these arguments are really successful to be able to do that. Seems like an arbitrary stopping point. Again, many, and if I would argue probably not most, Christian philosophers think that what's called the Richard argument, because it was actually formally proposed by Richard of St. Victor and then later picked up by Richard of Oxford, meaning Richard of Swinburne, in the 20th century. Imagine that. Richard of St. Victor was the first one to come up with this. And let's see, let me just get that, because when was Richard of St. Victor? Richard of St. Victor was in the 12th century. So it took a 12th century theologian. Listen to this. See, because Sahih Luke wants to say that it's actually known, this argument is necessarily known through general revelation, and it's necessarily entailed by God being all-loving. Not only is it not, but even after Trinitarians were former Trinitarians, no Trinitarian theologian really explicitly made this argument until the 12th century, after Christ and after the Trinity was formally revealed. So look how absurd that is. Wow. It took 12 centuries to really wrap your head around it and for it to be able to be known. So the fact that you claim that it's known refutes that even after Christians affirmed the Trinity for 12 centuries, as you claim, they didn't actually come up with it explicitly until Richard of St. Victor. So that disproves your claim that and somebody is saying Richard of St. Victor was earlier. Wait, I thought I just Googled it. Unless I'm Richard, let me just Google it again, because my buddy here is saying that he was 10th century. I thought he was 12th. I could have sworn he's 12th century. I'm getting here that he was 12th century. So unless this source is incorrect, I'm getting that he was 12th century. I'm not sure where you're getting 10th century, bud. But yeah, so 10th century, 12th century, doesn't matter. 12th, oh, he's saying, yeah, that I was correct. So it took almost 12 centuries to get this straight, even after the Trinity was formally revealed by Christ, supposedly. So this completely decimates the idea that this was known through general revelation, because even the church fathers didn't make the argument until St. Victor in the 12th century. Again, you would have to say that if this was explicit in creation and could be known so easily from general revelation, then the Jews not only were misguided because they didn't formally and explicitly believe in it until Second Temple Judaism, as you guys want to claim, right? But they believed, because if you say that a unipersonal God, what you're arguing is incoherent because God's love necessitates three persons, then you're saying that the Jews generally actually believed in an incoherent God. That is blasphemous to the prophets of the Old Testament and to the what you would consider the saints of the Old Testament and what we would view as the righteous servants of God in the Old Testament. No, they didn't explicitly believe in this. And to say this is just so eisegetical and retroactive, trying to impute it back onto early history. It just seems such a desperate concept. So honestly, I think that this argument has been completely debunked, such that if people watch this and they continue to make this argument, then I can only conclude one of two things. Either they didn't understand anything I said, they're delusional, or they're just dishonest. Honestly, that's because I see there's such strong points. And this is why even most Christian scholars in philosophy today do not accept this argument. So anyway, with that being said, guys, I hope that you guys enjoyed this explanation and debunking of this argument from divine love, that it somehow necessitates, or it makes much more plausible the argument for three divine persons, specifically from philosophy or general revelation alone. Anytime Christians bring this argument, send this to them, or send them directly to the Muslim metaphysician, and I'll deal with them. I'll deal with them, no problem. But also, I want to give a quick shout out to Thought Adventure Podcast, which I'm about. which I'm a part of. And that is, if you guys don't know, it's a podcast I'm a part of with 3 other Muslim brothers. Yusuf Ponders from Pondering Soul, Abdurrahman, and Sharif Abu Laith. And this Sunday, we're going to be having a stream on a popular atheist argument against God, which is called divine hiddenness, or the divine hiddenness argument. So go check out Thought Adventure Podcast over there. Do all the same things I recommend over here. Give us thumbs ups over there. Leave comments on the live streams. Share it. Subscribe to the channel. Leave comments on the videos afterwards. Really helps with all the algorithms. That's really beneficial for us. Really helps out. And then you can consider supporting. You can consider supporting us as well over there. We do have the ability for you to click that join button to become a member, as well as become a patron. And that really helps all of us out there, especially because some of the brothers, honestly, we need better equipment to provide a better aesthetics for these streams as well. So yeah, with that being said, consider doing those things for the Muslim Metaphysician channel, as well as Thought Adventure Podcast. I will see you guys all on the Thought Adventure Podcast this coming Sunday, inshallah. Also, our brother Yusuf Ponders has the coronavirus and he is sick. So please make dua for him, that Allah preserve and protect him and give him shifa and heal him from his sickness. I make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah would cure him from his illness and also give him ease in this time of difficulty. Ameen. And so please keep Brother Yusuf in your du'as. So I'm not sure if he's going to be able to make it this coming Sunday. I recommend that he actually take the rest and not join us. I think that he needs to really rest up and get over this, inshallah. So please make dua for him. But it should be the other 3 brothers. And if anything changes, check me out on Facebook and Twitter is where I'm most active on social media, where I constantly post updates. I'm now also on Clubhouse, which you can find a link on my Twitter and my Facebook. So do check me out on Clubhouse if you want to join, listen to some interesting discussions, and follow me there as well if you're not getting enough of me here, inshallah. Or if you've had enough of me after 2 hours, and you can just ignore Clubhouse. Yeah, people are still trying to get me on TikTok. I haven't budged and gotten on TikTok yet, but I finally budged and got on Clubhouse this past week, and I've been on for 4 or 5 days. I don't know what it is, and it's been, somewhat enjoyable. I enjoy being on there with the other Muslims, and a lot of people I do enjoy talking to there. Some people are just so out of left field and a bit frustrating, but may Allah guide us all. I mean, we got a new member here from Maz Mary Maria. That's an interesting name. So thank you for becoming a new member. May Allah reward you for that, and may Allah bless you. I mean, some people are saying they want 24 hours of Jake. Honestly, I can't even take that myself. I need to sleep at least 6 to 8 hours a day. I can't take that. So, but yeah, thanks for the support, guys. And I'll see you guys all, inshallah, on Sunday on the Thought Adventure podcast stream on divine hiddenness. And until next time on the Muslim Metaphysician channel, not sure what I'm going to be doing next. I'll let you guys know if I have an update on that soon. I do always try to post and create a stream for it ahead of time and then post it on my Twitter. So if you do guys want updates, because I noticed that I have more subscribers on YouTube than followers on Twitter and Facebook. And so there may be updates that you're missing out that you don't get on YouTube. I do try to post them on the community page, the community post of YouTube as well with updates, but I'm not as consistent and frequent with that just because I forget about it sometimes. Yeah, so Until next time, guys, I'm not sure of the topic yet, but until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.